Hello, good morning, and welcome to our class of American Church History. And this will be week number 6. And yeah, we are halfway through, and we have 5 more weeks to cover this American Church History. And I hope that you're enjoying this class. And since until last week, we have looked into the concept of history and how we do the history and why do we do the history. And especially doing American church history. And even though it was the conceptualizing and preparing you for the history lesson, that is the actual history lesson. These second half of this class will cover the events and important people in American church history. And I'll try to focus rather more on the big, trend rather than micro detailed events. That those records, if you're interested, and you can read it from books. So I don't want to repeat books. That's not how I teach. I like to try you to have that general overall perspective on American church history. And to begin, there's one thing that I was not able to finish last week, and that is there's a good history and a bad history. First, good history would have solid and reliable and valid facts. Reliable facts. Some of the record in the past history, they might not be so accurate. If you're not certain if those records are accurate or authentic, these are what the categories what makes it reliable, trustworthy. If those records are not trustworthy, then you still do the history with those records and facts, then you're not doing a bad history. So that kind of divide good history to bad history. If you edit, for instance, if you add something that is not fact, and if you present those as if it's fact, then you're lying. And you're not only lying, you're misleading and you're lying. If you mislead and you lie, that's a bad history. unfortunately, many historians did indeed either eliminate or reduce or add. There are many more than this, but when you do the interpretation of history, bad history does mislead, it does manipulate, and it does twist and even exaggerate. If you have a different perspective, you're going to present facts, and then thus you say, here's how some others interpret this, and my perspective says I interpret this way. That's how we do the balanced scholastic academic way of history. That's a good history. So if you have a different idea, different opinion, or different interpretation, then you're going to present yours with some analysis. So those readers who are reading your material can understand, at least be able to choose between the two. They will have, there's nothing neutral about history. It cannot be. There's no like a balanced history, which is impossible. So you're going to either stand on this side or that side as you do the history. And the many historians do these things and make a bad history. So as we do the church history, the American church history, we want to do the good history. Good history. You're not going to be historian, so most likely you're not going to write any material, but you should at least be able to make that discernment or judgment between the good history and bad history. So you will not be misled or manipulated or twisted or exaggerated. So that's good and bad history. We're going to do the good history here. And we're going to begin the part 2 of this American church history, beginning with the colonial era. So basically the American history so far least scholars and historians agree that there is a colonial period, and then after Revolutionary War, then you have a new America, independent. But that independence brings the North and South. And then there's America before emancipation and after emancipation. Emancipation means North and South, they fight because of the issue of slavery. But there's much more than slavery. I mean, you don't go into war just for the issue of slavery, but there's many economical and other philosophical and ideological reasons they go into the war. But the emancipation or the war, it's called the Civil War. So, before the Civil War and after the Civil War. Then there's a number 4 will be America before the World War I and II and after the World War I and II. That's rather a long period of time, but some people World War I is more significant than World War II, but for me, for American history, World War II will be more significant because World War II happens within. I mean, the America does involve in World War II, not the World War I. So after World War II, America becomes so-called a global power. Global power, and they do begin to lead the global happenings. Until then, probably the British would be the major, so-called major power. And then after World War II, the Russia and America, or the West, and then Russia will be the two superpowers. Then maybe it's too early to make that the distinction, but at least in America, 9/11 will be one of the major incident in modern era. So before 9/11, America before 9/11, then America after 9/11. Then this is really too early to say it, but the America before the COVID-19 and after COVID-19. This is not only America, but it's global. But that distinction need to be made in the future, because this is too early. We are going through it. We don't know how significant it's gonna be from the perspective of history. But as we see today, I mean, it is very significant events. I mean, it's been 2 years in global history, making impact and bringing the changes, whether it's positive or negative. So COVID-19 is going to be very significant thing in American history. But basically, the colonial independence and then Civil War would kind of distinguish. So the lesson, as you read the textbook, it covers up to World War II the most. But the American church does exist after World War II, but the modern ones, it's kind of too early to make it as the subject of more balanced and valid history. So we'll study up to World War II, and we'll begin with the colonial era. The colonial era is the time where the early settlement by the residents came in Mayflower, the ship, and they were called Puritans. So the Puritans are the major group of people who actually settled in America. Even though they called Columbus discovered America, that's very politically incorrect. And America was there as from the Western perspective, from Native Indians, Native Americans, not Indians. From Native Americans' perspective, that's baloney. It doesn't make sense. They were there. They don't need to be discovered by the white people. See, so no longer in America, if any historian used the word discovery of America, that's historically incorrect. Maybe you can say the expedition by Columbus and the armada, the ship, the band of the ships, they reached America. That might be a way to properly describe. But true word would be either they visited or they illegally entered. If we use today's concept, they illegally entered the land of America. That would be the good history. Bad history would say we discovered America. That's nonsense. Anyway, so that's not how we do the history. We want to do the good history and say, so Columbus is the first European who have reached North American soil. That's very objective description. But there's a very controversy about that fact. Is it facts that is Columbus and his band of the group of people are the first European who have reached the North American soil? There's someone called Amerigo Vespucci who actually give the name America. He might be the one. We do not know. Anyway, so the reason we call the colonial era is because these European countries came into the North America, which is already occupied by the native North Americans. They came in and make a settlement. And then it begins so-called colonialization. Even though the Puritans, they were the refugee, like boat people. The boat people, when the first named boat people in most recent history would be the people from Vietnam. The Vietnam was fall to communist, the communist in year 1976, I believe. And then many Vietnamese took boat and left the country. And they became boat people. So, one of the earliest boat people in history would be those Puritans, who are actually refugees. They are religious refugees, leaving Europe so they can practice free worship in elsewhere, and they chose to cross the Atlantic, very big body of water, and came to North America. because they said they believe they can worship here without someone else's persecution because of the reason of their belief. That's how it began. So, the early beginning, chapter 1. Historical context. Yeah, to begin the story of that Puritan and Plymouth and Mayflower, we need to look into what happened. From Europe, 1492, Columbus, and he masters ocean travel. It's not just he, but the Spanish Armada and all these Spanish merchants and Portuguese, and they were good with these ships and sailings, and they tried to discover from at least Western perspective, European perspective. They traveled and they crossed the Atlantic and then landed. They believed they were landing on west of India. That's why we call those areas Western Indies today. But they were wrong. They were actually landing on a new land they never knew before, from at least a European perspective. So they traveled and then reached those islands in the west of North America. And then there's a very active trade by English people. The England, they did have very, active trade with India, which later become also a English colony. English and the Europeans, they begin to colonize other world by using their technology and their wealth and then their power, and all these things come together to extend their power over the globe. And what the colony is, it's like the field that you grow your grains, your food. It's a source of your supply to help yourself, to make yourself richer. And that's human ego, whether it's an individual or whether it's a nation. You become egoistic, and there's something called nationalism. It is different from patriotism. Nationalism is rather egoistic, and it says our nation is the best. Our nation is the center of the world. Yeah, this might bring some objection from some of the students that I teach, but we have been through this. The Korea as a nation, we have so much focused on nationalism, and it still is. And we think we are better than some other countries around us, and or at least they try to be better than them. So the Korea, as you know, is between China and Japan. Both countries, China is much bigger than Korea, and Japan is a little bigger than, they have about 1 billion, no, 100 million people, while Korea, South Korea has about 50 million. Even if you include the North Korea, it would be like 70 million. So we're smaller than Japan in at least the size of the land and the number of people. So we are in between China and Japan. And as we read the history past like 5,000 years of history between China, Korea, and Japan, there has been constant wars. And Korea has been colonized by Mongolia for 80 some years, and recently by Japan for 36 years. See, these dynamics help, or it kind of grows the nationalism. You try to survive as a nation, and then there's that political ideology saying this, our nation is the best, the most powerful. We are the center of the world. The same with every individual human being. So the nation is a reflection of us, every individual human being. So same thing in the Japan and China. I mean, there's a nationalism in Japan, nationalism in China. Unfortunately, these nationalism feed its people with the wrong ideas, which eventually end up having war against one another. So this false and kind of negative kind of nationalism brings a very unfortunate outcome. On the contrary, patriotism is love for your country. That's much different than nationalism that we are talking about. It's the nationalism that caused World War I by Germans. And it's again nationalism that brought World War II involving Japan, attacking the Pearl Harbor and causing all these more further issues of World War II. Actually, World War II is a German. World War I is a little different. Anyway, so it's the nationalism that causes all these negative aspect of history. And we need to remember the America, it begins with this colonization by England. Even though the Puritan came as a refugee, the people followed after that, like 3 million within next 100 years. They came to America and then colonized North America. So that's proper word, colonial period. But this I need to note. When the American, you go to American high school or junior high school and learn this American history, and it's from the majority white people's perspective. They have been colonized by the England. That's how they perceive the colonial period. No, that's not true. That's bad history. The Europeans came in and colonized Native Americans. And you don't read that much in history books. Because, why? No, they do bad history. There are a lot of killings, massacres, and very unfair invasions. That those are not recorded. And, that burden is still, the reason I'm saying this is that burden, that guilt, and that the cost and price is still up on the American church. So as we do the American church history, and as a member of American church, we need to be aware of this very unfortunate, sad history, and history that we do not want to, express or even study. So it has to do with all this big trend, Europe trying to feed themselves their own ego with a nationalism, and then there's a Reformation in Europe in 16th century, early 16th century, which is 1517. The date is actually the date Martin Luther, nailed that statement on the door of that famous cathedral. See, the Reformation in Europe is a major event in a church history. And that event, Reformation, has a big impact, major impact in American church history as well. Even though it happened just before the actual settlement of the European, Puritans in Plymouth, it has very close relation. So we need to be aware of that Reformation as a very historical background context. And then post-Reformation. After the Reformation, the Catholics and then these Protestants, they are kind of in conflict. So that also affects the reading and understanding of the American church history. Reformation is, it's both theological, doctrinal, and then political. As we read the church history, there's always this theological part of it, and then power part of it. So much of the history, even though it's a church history, it does have very significance and relevance to the power struggle, power conflict. And don't forget it. The church is still a human organization. It's not perfect. It's not so divine because it's a church. No, that's nonsense. Church is just a group of people, a human institution. And that's reality. That's reality and that we are looking at. So we need to be real while we do the history. We don't want to, beautify or make it sound so holy. No, we want to be very objective, critical, and true to the facts. Okay, let's have a short break and I'll come back. Okay, let us continue. So the colonial period, the reason for the beginning of the settlement in the land of North America, it all comes from these things that are happening in the other side of Atlantic. And there's a pietism which begins in Germany in around the 17th century. And pietism basically is being very spiritual. The people want to be very spiritual. After the Reformation, there are several developments that are happening around Europe. And basically it's to bring the change. That's what the reform is. Reform is, bringing the change by redoing the things. So one of the result of reform is pietism, to be holy, to focus on more of the religious aspect, because before the Reformation, Catholic Church became so institutionalized, so formalized. And then there is a development called these are some other development in Europe. National Church. As the Reformation result, Protestant test against the Pope, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church at the time of Reformation, they, were ruling the most part of the Europe, except there's a Greek Orthodox Church and the so-called Eastern churches. The Eastern churches were separated from European Catholic churches, but Catholic churches still cover the Rome and the part of the Northern Africa and all other parts of Europe. And there's one church, even though there are many nations in Europe at the time. And so there's nothing so-called a national church. And it's all under Vatican. And still, it's the same in the Vatican. But the national church, for example, We got two examples. Lutheran Church in German. I mean, all the German Protestant believers belong to this Lutheran Church. And actually, the Germans cut the tie with the Vatican, the Rome, and then they, start their own independent church after Martin Luther, the reformer. Also, the Anglican Church, with a religious and political reason, they cut off from the Catholic Church. So much of the Anglican tradition, as you see the Anglican Church, if you know some of Anglican Church and Episcopal churches, they are still more like a Catholic in the way of worship and so on. But the doctrinally, theologically speaking, they're Protestant. So the Anglican Church is a Church of England. It's the same, Anglican Church and Church of England is the same thing. So they're the development of national churches. And now the thing is that the Anglican Church, still having that DNA of Catholic Church, is very hierarchic and authoritarian and political and institutionalized. Thus, they believed all the church members within the England, the land of England and the colony of England, they need to follow the orders and the authority of Anglican church leaders. So that's how they perceived a church. So it's much different from today's Protestant church that we know. Today's Christian church, especially the Baptist, they are just individual congregation having the association together. That's the Southern Baptist Association or convention. So that's much different idea of how church is institutionalized or organized. So that's major difference between these, even within the Christian denominations. The denominations means the divisions. So within the Protestant church, there are many different denominations, and each denomination have their own authority. There's no pope, no one person who's, controlling all these different denominations. They are just Christian or Protestant with a different organization. That's how we see the denominations today, the modern churches. But within the Anglican, Lutheran, and Church of Netherlands, and then Denmark, and so on, within the European churches, there rises a certain movement, just like a Pietism in German and Anabaptist. See, there are a group of people who kind of share different ideas about how we should believe God, how we should run the church, how we should organize our community of believers. So these causes the trouble. But the church, the national church, tried to control these small uprising movements. They did not give the freedom to these group of people and even begin to persecute in the name of national church. That's how all these began. So there are conflicts, and some even died for the cause of having the so-called religious freedom. These two things, the religious freedom and then the separation of church and state, or how the church and state should relate, that's the major theme in understanding American church history or America itself. The Republican and Democrats, down to the bottom, has to do with this. The abortion issues, the gay rights issues, or the racial issues, the black, American. See, that's what caused the war between the North and South. That mentality is still there. It's not gone after 150 years later. Many think that's been resolved. There's no more slaves. Yeah, there are no more slaves. But if you go to South in America, if you go to like in New Orleans, Minneapolis, Mississippi, down in Mississippi, it's almost like Africa. I've been there in Africa, and if you go to some of the rural area in Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, they're just like, the condition, the quality of life for the blacks there is much different from what you see in California. California is not all America. Some may think when you see California is America. No, if you go to East Maryland, Virginia, the New England, these areas, as Massachusetts, it's very different country. They're a very different country than California. And if you go to down south, it's much different. And if you go to Texas, that's one nation. Texas is actually a nation. They have their own culture and different ideas. See, what it caused the Civil War is still there. It's still there. So religious freedom in the church and state that is the main concern and the theme in understanding American church history. So if someone asked, what do you think is the major issues in understanding American church history? These are the two things. The church and state, the conflict or the dynamic is still going on. It's still going on. You see this in the news every day. So you think it's just an issue of a vaccination. The COVID-19 and only 60-some% of the adults who are eligible are vaccinated today. And what about the rest of them? Like 40%, almost 40%. In some states, it's like only 20% vaccinated and rest of 80% are not vaccinated. Look at those maps. And they fall all to the south. And then the middle north. So-called Bible belts are the major states who are against vaccination. So it strongly has to do with their belief the church there. And it has to do with all the history that we are going to read and see. So as you understand the history of church history of America, then you will be able to understand the things that are happening in America today, especially during this COVID pandemic. Why they believe the way they believe. You think, I mean, at least I think the Trump and some of the people around him, it doesn't make sense. But for them, majority of people in the South and in the Bible Belt, he makes perfect sense. See, so we can safely say there are two Americas still, two America still existing. It may not be like a North and South anymore, but what divided the North and South and made them to engage in killing one another in the same land, it is still there, remaining, unresolved. And the history tries to resolve those issues between these two Americas. Two America. It's almost 50-50. And, it's always little tipped over to this side or tipped over to that side. And it is decided by the state like a Pennsylvania, so-called swing states. These states are where these two group of people are almost equally present. But other states, for example, the California is one group, one kind of America, while the Mississippi, Louisiana is another America. See, that's how we find, and that all of these things happening in America today has to do with the history. There's certainly a very close connection to what happened before even the America was. It is still influencing and affecting what we see today in America. And the Reformation is one of the major events that happened in Europe and still affecting the America as is, not only religiously, but politically as well. And the Baptists, they are the ones who believed there has to be a second baptism. The infant baptism is just formal, institutionalized. It does have no meaning for one's faith, one's belief, or one's salvation. You have to be baptized as an adult to be a genuine, true believer. That's the whole idea of Anabaptism. And then it later becomes, because of Anabaptist, there's a Baptist, Mennonites, and Quaker. These are not from Europe as indigenous. I mean, it has been born, and it happened in American soil. But Quakers and Mennonites and Baptists, it has all roots, all going back to Europe. What happened in the Europe before, they came to America. So as we see, jury in German, I think it's German. Yeah, there's in 16th century, 1525, January 21st, there's a very first adult baptism, which is against Catholicism or Anglican or Lutheran Church. They did not allow or even have the idea of second baptism or adult baptism. They are born into as a German, as an English, which means they are automatically the member of the Church of England or Church of Germany, the Lutheran Church. So their nationality equals to the church membership, which is no longer valid. But at the time of early, 16th century, it was true. And then there were people who were against that formalism or legalistic, belief, which was what they were against, Catholics. But they only changed the name and then kept the tradition of Catholicism. So that caused problem for some people, and they were against it, and they were beginning to organize it and become. They were labeled in such a name by the Lutheran or Anglican churches, and so they were called Anabaptist because they are redoing the baptism, and which becomes very core issue, which relates to the religious freedom, or more specifically see, this is the main thing. The freedom to worship in the ways and the manner that we wish and hope and desires to. So basically saying, I want to worship the way I want to. You don't tell me how to worship. No one can tell me how to worship. So this is it becomes the core idea of democracy. Actually, it does. The democratic society, I want to be who I am. I want to eat the things I like. I want to sleep where I want to sleep. I want to live where I like to live. See, this is a basic so-called human right. So this desire and discussion and ideology for the human rights, it began and born as the freedom to worship or to believe whatever I want to believe. The nation, my country, or my church cannot and should not tell me what to believe, how to believe, where to worship, and where your church membership is going to be. See, that's the key issue, that's human rights. And this so-called freedom to worship, religious freedom, becomes it triggers the idea of human rights. So if you try to understand the democracy, you cannot avoid relating that to the worship to freedom to worship. And as Thomas Jefferson writes his copy, the draft of the Declaration of Independence. His basic belief and idea comes from the Bible. So you have to remember the Christian faith and the democracy we see has very close relationship. And also it's ironical, the communism and socialism, right, comes from the Bible. Did you know that? Especially those you Chinese students. Did you know that these ideas, Karl Marx is the one who actually began to present the idea of communism, and that the idea of communism came from the book of Acts in the New Testament. In the book of Acts chapter 2, it talks about the people sharing the goods and no one saying this is mine. There's a very original the description of communism and the idea, and Karl Marx took it to make it a political ideology. That's how it happened. So, I mean, to understand the European or the Western, politics, Western culture and society, you have to go back to the Bible, because the church was a nation and nation was the church sometime in the past. Just like a communist party is the nation and the nation is community, the almost equal to the communist party in up north of South Korea. So the very similar dynamic had gone. Then there's the Enlightenment. Enlightenment actually comes from this idea of freedom to worship, expanding its idea to the just every human aspect. So freedom to be you, the individual, a person, and that's against all the ideas they had before. By Catholicism, even the Reformation had not reached that level, but as you study the Bible, these thinkers, philosophers, who are basically they are Christians, they begin to realize God had designed every single person to be worthy of honor, worthy of the respect, worthy of being who he or she is as a person. So there's no one up there or down there, no hierarchy amongst the people, and we call it and they called it God-given dignity, which relates itself to the enlightenment. Enlightenment, suddenly the light comes. It was dark before because you are so manipulated by the church and you didn't know who you are. Now it lightens you. Suddenly you see the light and you're liberated. the word enlightenment has a very close tie to liberty. You're enlightened to the liberty. And so in Europe, so-called Age of Reason begins in the 17th century. From it was an age of religion. And the thing is, religion at the time is and was and still is to some degree is irrational. So as these thinkers, philosophers, like a Kant, and then later Nietzsche, as they become one of those leaders in enlightenment, they criticize religion, which is Christianity. I mean, in Europe, when you talk about religion, it's Christianity. The Christianity, whether it's Catholic or Protestant, Lutheran Church, Anglican Church, this so-called Christian thing, religious thing, is irrational and unreasonable, mystical, it's manipulating, narrow perspective, and so on. That was the label of the religion at the time. So rather than faith, they were against this institutionalized religion, which is both Catholic, Protestant, Lutheran, Anglican, and all these formalized, institutionalized church. So church, religion was the same word for them. And the label by the Enlightenment thinkers, they were irrational and unreasonable, mystical, misleading. It kills your intellect. That's how it was, religion at the time. And sadly and unfortunately, still many churches are doing the same thing in the name of religion. They, manipulate their members, the believers. They mislead, and they focus on something that's mystical, or mystical, or the doctrine they tell you is very irrational and unreasonable. So what happens today is the young people, younger generation who are very intellectual and rational and reasonable, They want the religion to make sense. And many church leaders failing to do that. So that's what the history teaches us today. Those are the lessons that we need to learn. So as we look at these contexts, what had happened in the past, it repeats itself today. Even though the ways they're happening are not the same, but still, very similar stuff is happening today. And that's why we are doing the history. Okay, I think time's up for today. And yeah, I think we'll stop here. And next week, we'll start with the colonial period and this topic. So thank you for coming and listening to the this very lesson and lecture. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye. Take care.